The auction hall smelled of dust, sweat, and cold despair. Its wooden floors were scuffed and worn from years of use, and the air was thick with murmurs and shouts. Buyers' men with hardened faces and sharp eyes milled about, holding clipboards and counting coins, sizing up the small, fragile human lives on offer. On a raised platform in the center of the room, a tiny basket sat under a dim, flickering lantern. Inside lay a newborn girl, barely more than a wisp of life, her skin pink but mottled, her tiny fists curling and unclenching with instinctive weakness. She had been born only hours ago, yet already the weight of the world pressed on her fragile shoulders. A thin line of blood still marked the curve of her belly where she had been cut from her mother, who had been absent from the proceedings, sold into poverty, or banished from choice. Her cries were faint but piercing, a sound that seemed to claw through the coldness of the room. Most ignored it. For them, she was merely an object of commerce, a commodity to be measured against profit. The auctioneer's voice cut through the air, sharp and insistent. Next, a fine little girl, barely a day old, who will start the bidding. Hands shot up, scribbles were made on clipboards, and voices began to rise in a chaotic chorus. One man shouted, 1,000, no less. Another quickly countered, raising the amount without a hint of concern for the child in the basket. The crowd's energy was relentless, a storm of greed that made the newborn's tiny form seem impossibly fragile. The baby's eyes fluttered open, revealing the dark, unfocused gaze of someone still learning to perceive the world. Her lips quivered, her small body shivering against the rough cloth that barely kept her warm. She did not understand what was happening. Her world had been reduced to cold wood, harsh voices, and the occasional flash of movement as bidders jostled for dominance. Her innocence made her small, vulnerable, and dependent entirely on the hands that might claim her. Amid the clamor, a quiet figure entered the hall, a rancher, tall and solid, with eyes that seemed to notice everything. Unlike the others, he did not shout or wave his hand for attention. He did not carry a clipboard, a ledger, or a sense of urgency. Instead, he simply observed. His gaze lingered on the tiny baby, taking in her pale skin, the faint line of blood, the shivering body that would go unnoticed by most. There was no greed in his expression, only concern and a silent question. How could such a delicate life survive in this world of harshness and cruelty? The auctioneer's voice rose higher, driving the bidding forward. Who will give this little one a home? Who will take responsibility for her life? The crowd erupted, the energy almost suffocating. Some bidders raised obscene amounts without hesitation, their faces hard and cold. Others whispered, calculating how much they could profit from her later, their intentions merciless. The baby's small cries continued, fragile against the roar of human avarice. The rancher remained quiet, yet he felt a growing urgency. He could not allow her to become just another name in a ledger, another soul commodified and discarded. Every instinct in his body, the compassion he had cultivated through years of working the land, caring for animals and protecting the vulnerable, told him that he had to act. The crowd might not understand, might see his intent as folly, but the tiny life before him demanded a champion. As the gavel threatened to fall, the rancher stepped forward, his calm presence cutting through the frenzy. He raised his hand, signaling to the auctioneer. "I'll take her," he said quietly, but with unmistakable determination. A hush fell over the room. The bidders blinked in disbelief, some scoffing, others murmuring among themselves. The baby, unaware of the significance, only felt the warmth of the man who now claimed her life. In that single moment, the balance of the auction shifted. A life teetering on the edge of neglect and exploitation was now in hands that, while quiet, promised protection. The tiny newborn, still too young to understand, was given a chance, a fragile, precious chance to survive, to grow, and perhaps one day to thrive. The gavel fell. The crowd reacted with surprise and indignation, but the rancher cradled her, carefully moving away from the platform. In his arms she felt the first warmth and safety she had ever known, though she did not yet comprehend it. Outside the chaos of the hall, her life had taken the first decisive turn toward freedom, guided by a man whose quiet strength would shape her future in ways she could not yet imagine. The auction hall's chaos lingered in the air as the rancher held the newborn in his arms, her tiny body trembling from shock and cold. He stepped carefully through the throng of disbelieving bidders and murmuring spectators, his long coat brushing against the rough wooden floor. Every eye followed him with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed judgment. Most, could not comprehend why anyone would pay such a sum for a fragile infant who might not even survive the day, let alone grow into adulthood. The rancher's expression remained calm, almost serene, despite the growing tension around him. He was a man of few words and deliberate actions, accustomed to solitude on his vast ranch. But beneath his quiet demeanor was a heart shaped by experience, one that had witnessed suffering, injustice, and the silent struggles of life on the margins. This newborn, small, vulnerable, and bleeding from birth, stirred something deep within him, an undeniable sense of responsibility. Carrying her carefully, he made his way to the exit, ignoring the whispers and the disapproving glares. "She's too weak," someone muttered under their breath. Another voice scoffed, "You'll regret wasting your money." The rancher said nothing. He had learned long ago that words were often useless in the face of ignorance. His focus was solely on the infant in his arms, whose soft cries were beginning to grow stronger under the warmth he provided. Every careful adjustment of the blanket, every gentle pat, was a silent promise she would be protected, no matter the cost. As he stepped outside, the cold night air hit him, biting at his face and hands. But the baby, swaddled in layers of cloth he had brought, began to quiet. Her breathing became steadier, and her small fingers curled around his thumb instinctively. The rancher had chosen a route that avoided main streets, knowing the dangers of being followed or intercepted. The roads to his property were long and often treacherous, but he had traveled them countless times. This journey, however, was more delicate than any he had undertaken before. He was carrying life itself, fragile and irreplaceable. The baby stirred, her tiny cries breaking the silence of the night. The rancher paused for a moment, studying her small face. Her dark, unfocused eyes blinked up at him, and for a fleeting second, he imagined the world she might grow into, a life not dictated by cruelty or commerce, but by care, freedom, and possibility. He could already sense the resilience within her, a quiet will to survive despite her weakness. That resilience would need nurturing, patience, and protection, but he was prepared to give it all. The journey was not without its challenges. Narrow paths through dense woods, uneven terrain, and hidden obstacles slowed their progress. At one point, a sudden gust of wind blew leaves into their path, startling the baby and causing a small wail to escape her lips. The rancher immediately hushed her, rocking her gently, whispering calm reassurances that, though she could not understand the words, seemed to resonate in her instinctive response. He adjusted the blanket around her more securely, shielding her from the chill, and continued forward, his focus unwavering. Along the way, he reflected on the cruelty of the auction. How many had been left to die because they were deemed weak or inconvenient? How many lives had been extinguished before they had the chance to even cry out? He had witnessed suffering before, but this felt different, personal, urgent, and impossible to ignore. For this infant, every moment mattered. Every step he took toward the ranch was a step away from a fate of neglect and ficaon. By the time the distant lights of his ranch appeared on the horizon, the baby had begun to relax, her tiny body resting more comfortably in his arms. She was still fragile, still trembling occasionally, but she was alive. More importantly, she was safe for now. The rancher's presence had become a shield against the harshness of the world, a promise that her life mattered, and that she would not be left to the whims of those who saw her only as property. As he reached the ranch gates, the rancher felt a profound sense of relief mingled with resolve. The night had been long and the journey difficult, but the most crucial part had been accomplished. She had been removed from immediate danger. What lay ahead, the challenges of nurturing, protecting, and raising her, was vast, but he was ready. In his arms lay not just a newborn infant, but a chance to rewrite her story, to give her a life she deserved, and to prove that even in a cruel world, compassion could prevail. The auction hall still buzzed with tension and disbelief as the rancher held the newborn close, her tiny body warm against his chest despite the lingering chill of the room. The other bidders exchanged incredulous glances. Some muttered under their breath, questioning his sanity, while others outright laughed at what they perceived as a foolish investment. To them, she was just another commodity, weak, fragile, and, to their eyes, nearly worthless. But the rancher saw something entirely different, a spark of life that deserved protection, a future that could be nurtured if only she survived the critical hours ahead. The auctioneer slammed his gavel down repeatedly, attempting to maintain control over the room. Sold? To the gentleman in the back, he shouted, his voice echoing off the wooden rafters. Gasps swept through the crowd as the rancher approached the stage. The baby's tiny cries seemed louder in the sudden silence, as if she knew something monumental had just happened. Her small eyes blinked up at him, the raw vulnerability in her gaze piercing through the indifference of the spectators. As he stepped onto the platform, he cradled her with care, making sure every movement was gentle and deliberate. Her limbs were fragile, her cries fragile, and every sound seemed to echo the weight of her ordeal. The rancher's hands were steady and strong, his experience with animals and people alike lending him confidence in handling delicate lives. He adjusted the blanket around her, tucking her in snugly without restricting her tiny movements. Ensuring warmth and comfort, the crowd continued to murmur, some whispering indignantly, others openly questioning why he had paid such a large sum for a newborn in obvious distress. She won't last a day, one man scoffed. You've wasted your money. Another muttered, why would anyone care about a weak little thing like that? The rancher ignored them. To him, their ignorance was irrelevant. Their approval had never mattered. His focus was singular, ensuring the baby survived her first night, the most precarious period of her life. Once the transaction was complete, the rancher carefully maneuvered through the hall, stepping over scattered hay and the discarded items left from previous auctions. He could feel the baby relaxing slightly against his chest, her cries less frantic, her tiny fists opening and closing as though testing the world around her. He whispered softly, words she couldn't yet understand, but the tone was gentle and soothing. Reassurance, warmth, and a promise that she was now safe. Exiting the auction hall, he faced the night air. Cold and sharp, it was a harsh contrast to the dim warmth inside, but he had prepared for this journey. A small lantern illuminated the path ahead, and the rancher moved carefully. Each step deliberate to avoid startling the baby, he avoided the main roads, knowing that anyone watching or following could threaten the infant's safety. Shadows danced across the walls and ground, creating a tense, almost cinematic scene, but he remained calm. Every instinct, every muscle, every thought was focused on her survival. The journey away from the auction hall was not just physical, it was symbolic. He was taking her out of a world that saw her as nothing more than property, and into one where her life would be valued, nurtured, and protected. With each step, he felt the immense responsibility of being the first person in her life to provide genuine care. He could feel her heartbeat against his chest, tiny and rapid, a fragile pulse that demanded vigilance and attention. As the distant outline of his ranch emerged against the night sky, the rancher felt a cautious optimism. The most dangerous part, securing her away from the auction and the predatory hands of others, was accomplished. Yet the work had only just begun. He had rescued her from immediate harm, but her survival would depend on warmth, nourishment, and patient care over the coming days. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but in that moment, holding the fragile newborn, he also felt hope. The baby stirred slightly, and the rancher adjusted his grip, whispering another soft reassurance. She had survived the auction. She had survived the night outside her mother's care. And for the first time, someone had chosen to fight for her life. That simple act, a quiet man paying for her survival, had changed her fate, giving her the first breath of hope in a world that had otherwise been indifferent. In his arms, she represented both vulnerability and potential. And as they approached the ranch, the rancher understood the gravity of the task ahead. To nurture her, protect her, and give her the chance to grow into the life she deserved, one not defined by cruelty, but by care, compassion, and freedom. The night stretched long and silent as the rancher carried the fragile newborn through narrow dirt paths leading away from the auction hall. The surrounding darkness was heavy and unyielding, broken only by the faint glow of a lantern he had brought along. Each step he took was cautious, measured, as if any misstep could jeopardize the fragile life in his arms. The baby, swaddled carefully in soft cloth, occasionally let out tiny cries, but they were less frantic now, as though sensing the safety. In the warmth and steadiness of his hold, the rancher's mind was focused entirely on the journey. He had chosen a remote route, one that wound through forests and past streams, avoiding roads and potential watchers. His experience living and working in the wilderness had taught him the value of silence, patience, and observation. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the underbrush caused his senses to sharpen. The baby's life depended on his vigilance, and he had learned that in situations like these, hesitation could be fatal. Though he moved with caution, he also understood the importance of maintaining calm for the newborn. She was perceptive in her own way, sensitive to tension, noise, and abrupt movements. He adjusted the swaddle around her, making sure she was warm yet comfortable. Her tiny fingers occasionally brushed against his hand, a fleeting touch that reminded him of the preciousness of life he now held in his arms. Her tiny heartbeat, rapid and fragile, echoed in rhythm with his own careful breathing, and he found himself speaking softly, whispering gentle reassurances in a tone that conveyed safety, even if the words themselves were meaningless to her. The journey was arduous. Muddy patches and uneven terrain slowed his progress, forcing him to navigate carefully. At times he had to step over fallen branches or avoid puddles that could cause him to slip. Each careful movement was a testament to his unwavering dedication. Though he was strong and experienced, the weight of responsibility pressed on him. This was more than a simple rescue. It was the act of claiming a life from the jaws of cruelty and negligence, and he was acutely aware that one miscalculation could undo everything. As the hours passed, the rancher noticed subtle signs of life. Returning to the baby, her cries softened, and she began to relax slightly in his arms, trusting the warmth and rhythm of his movements. Her breathing became steadier, her tiny limbs occasionally stretching as though testing the safety of her surroundings. The rancher allowed himself a quiet sigh of relief, knowing that these small signs meant she was adjusting, that she was beginning to survive beyond mere instinct. He reflected briefly on the cruelty of the auction hall, the way people had shouted over her cries as if they were selling livestock rather than human life. The indifference and greed he had witnessed earlier had left a mark on him, reminding him of how easily innocence could be exploited. It strengthened his resolve. Every step closer to the ranch was a step away from exploitation and toward a chance at life, at love, at protection. Finally, the outline of the ranch appeared in the distance, bathed in the first hints of dawn. The sight brought a measure of comfort to both the man and the infant. The ranch, secluded and fortified against intruders, represented safety in a world that had so far been harsh and uncaring. He quickened his pace slightly, carrying the newborn across the last stretch of field, feeling a quiet anticipation of the security and warmth that awaited her. Upon reaching the ranch gates, he paused to survey the area. Everything was in place: the pens, the stables, the cabin, all prepared for life that required care, attention, and protection. The baby shifted slightly in his arms, her tiny eyes fluttering open to the sight of this new world. For the first time, she glimpsed a place that promised safety rather than danger. The rancher smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement that his mission for the night was nearly complete. Inside the ranch, he carried her to a prepared room, a small, warm cabin with a soft bed and blankets layered to provide comfort. He laid her gently in the center, covering her with a clean, soft cloth. The baby's tiny hands reached out instinctively, brushing against the material as if testing its security. The rancher knelt beside her, his watchful eyes scanning her form for any signs of distress, any indication that she might still be vulnerable. In that quiet room, Far from the chaos and cruelty of the auction hall, the newborn experienced her first true sense of safety. She was no longer a commodity, no longer a pawn in someone else's greed. In the arms of the rancher she had found sanctuary, and though she did not yet understand it, her life had been claimed not for profit, but for care. The journey to the ranch had ended, but her story was just beginning. Every cautious step, every protective measure had led her to this moment a chance at life, nurtured by someone who saw her not as property, but as a person worthy of survival, hope, and love. The rancher finally arrived at his secluded cabin, the newborn safely cradled in his arms. The warmth of the fire in the hearth was a stark contrast to the cold, harsh world she had left behind at the auction hall. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and hay, a comforting aroma that would become familiar and safe over time. Every detail of the room had been prepared with care-soft blankets, a small cradle, and a quiet corner shielded from drafts. This was the first space she could call her own, a sanctuary where danger could not touch her fragile body. He gently laid her in the cradle, adjusting the blankets to ensure she was warm but not constrained. Her tiny body, still trembling slightly from fatigue and the trauma of the auction, began to relax under his careful touch. He whispered softly, words she could not yet understand, but the tone was soothing and full of reassurance. The rancher knew that trust had to be nurtured as much as her physical health. She had been discarded once, and if he was to help her heal, she needed to feel safe and protected from the very start. The night settled in around them, quiet except for the soft crackling of the fire. The rancher stayed close, monitoring her, breathing in comfort, adjusting blankets and murmuring gentle reassurances whenever she stirred. He had experienced the fragility of life before: animals, injured travelers, and other vulnerable beings, but nothing compared to the weight of responsibility he now carried. Every minute of this night mattered, and any lapse could have dire consequences. Feeding the baby required patience and precision. He warmed a small bottle, carefully measuring the formula and checking its temperature. She latched on with weak determination, her small fingers gripping his hand instinctively. The rancher marveled at the tiny strength in her grasp, a subtle reminder that she was a survivor, even in her most fragile state. He fed her slowly, allowing her to drink at her own pace, careful not to overwhelm her delicate system. Each swallow, each sigh of satisfaction, reassured him that she would live, that his intervention had truly made a difference. Once she had eaten, he cleaned her gently, mindful of her sensitive skin and the bruising from birth. Every motion was deliberate, careful not to cause pain or alarm. The baby's eyes flickered open occasionally, gazing up at him with trust forming in the depth of her dark, unfocused eyes. The rancher realized that this was the first time she had felt consistent care, attention, and gentleness, experiences most children took for granted, yet for her, they were revolutionary. As the night deepened, the baby's breathing became steady, and she finally drifted into a peaceful sleep. The rancher stayed nearby, sitting quietly in a chair by the fire, watching over her. He allowed himself a rare moment of reflection, thinking of the journey that had brought them here from the cold, greedy auction hall to this warm, protective cabin. Every step, every careful maneuver had been essential to her survival, and he understood the weight of his responsibility. The first night at the ranch was not just about providing warmth and food. It was about establishing the foundation of trust. The baby had to feel that the world could be safe, that her life mattered, and that the man who held her would protect her at all costs. The rancher knew that her early experiences had been marked by neglect and cruelty, and it would take time, patience, and consistent care for her to fully relax and grow. By the time the first hints of dawn crept through the cabin window, the baby slept soundly, her tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically. The rancher gently stroked her hair and whispered a quiet promise that she would never be alone again, that she would have the chance to live a life defined by safety, love, and freedom. In that first night, the newborn had experienced something she had never known: security, warmth, and protection. She had survived the auction, survived the journey, and now rested in the arms of someone who had claimed her life not for profit but for care. It was a small beginning, yet it held the promise of a future built on trust, patience, and unwavering dedication. That night marked the true start of her journey toward life, health, and eventual independence of life, shaped not by cruelty, but by compassion. The days following her first night at the ranch were filled with quiet routines and gentle care. Under the rancher's watchful eyes, the newborn began to show signs of remarkable resilience. Her tiny body, once frail and trembling, slowly strengthened with each feeding, each warm bath, and every carefully administered touch. The rancher approached each moment with deliberate patience, understanding that her survival depended not only on nourishment, but on a constant sense of safety and trust. Each morning began with soft sunlight spilling through the cabin windows, illuminating the small, cozy room that had become her sanctuary. The rancher would prepare her meals with meticulous care, warming them to just the right temperature, ensuring that each feeding was unhurried and comforting. The baby's cries gradually softened as she grew accustomed to his presence, her small hands instinctively reaching for his fingers and her eyes tracking his movements with growing awareness. Each interaction reinforced the bond between them, and the rancher found himself marveling at the small but significant progress she made. Daily. Beyond feeding, the rancher took time to ensure her body developed properly. He gently moved her limbs during diaper changes and bath times, encouraging muscle growth and coordination. Though the movements were slight, the baby's tiny body responded, gaining strength and confidence. Every coo, every stretch, every subtle gesture was a testament to her determination to survive. The rancher knew that while nature had given her resilience, his care would allow it to flourish. As the days turned into weeks, he introduced her to the sights and sounds of the ranch in small, controlled ways. The gentle lowing of cows, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the distant calls of birds became familiar comforts rather than sources of fear. She began to respond to these stimuli with curiosity rather than apprehension, her dark eyes widening as she absorbed the world around her. The rancher allowed these moments to be brief and unhurried, ensuring that she remained safe while gradually expanding her awareness. The emotional bond between the rancher and the child grew steadily. He spoke to her in quiet tones, narrating his work and explaining the movements of the animals, even though she could not yet comprehend the words. The rhythm and consistency of his voice became a source of reassurance, teaching her that the world could be gentle and that she had a protector who would never abandon her. In return, she began to show early signs of recognition, turning her head toward his voice, calming when she felt his touch, and occasionally grasping his hand with newfound strength. The rancher also recognized the importance of fostering resilience beyond physical growth. Though she was still fragile, he ensured she experienced small challenges, gentle stretches, new textures and sounds to help her build confidence and adaptability. He monitored her responses carefully, stepping in only when necessary to prevent overwhelm or harm. These small, intentional exposures allowed her to grow not just stronger, but more aware and capable in her environment. Every night he remained vigilant as she slept, watching over her chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm, listening to the quiet sounds of her breathing. He understood that the foundation for her future, her health, her confidence, and her sense of trust was being built in these early moments of consistent care and attention. His dedication was unwavering, and every small sign of growth reinforced his quiet determination to provide her with a life free from the neglect and cruelty she had endured before. By the end of this period, the newborn was no longer the frail, trembling infant brought from the auction. She had grown stronger, more alert, and increasingly responsive to the world around her. Each movement, each glance, each coo was a testament to the success of his careful, patient care. The rancher observed her with a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that while the journey ahead was still long, the most critical phase, her fragile beginnings, had been navigated successfully. In these weeks, a pattern of trust, strength, and resilience was firmly established. The baby had survived not just through luck, but through the unwavering commitment of the rancher who had claimed her life. Together, they had begun to transform vulnerability into potential, fear into trust, and survival into the foundation for a life defined not by cruelty, but by care, protection, and hope. Life at the ranch had settled into a rhythm of safety, warmth, and gradual growth for the young child. The newborn, now several months old, had begun to respond to the world around her with curiosity and increasing confidence. Yet, even in this isolated sanctuary, the shadows of her past loomed, unseen but persistent. The auction hall, the men who treated life as property, and the cruel indifference she had faced were not easily forgotten, not by her, and certainly not by the rancher who had witnessed the depths of human greed firsthand. It began subtly, with distant rumors drifting through the nearby town. The rancher, cautious and observant, overheard whispers at the market and along the trails he frequented. "They say the little one survived the auction," a farmer mentioned, lowering his voice. "That man who bought her, does he know what he's doing?" Others scoffed, unaware of the gravity behind the words, but the rancher understood all too well. Wherever there was profit or cruelty, there were those willing to pursue it. Even when it meant harming the innocent, he became vigilant. Every perimeter of the ranch was checked and reinforced. Fences were strengthened, hidden paths monitored, and the surrounding forest scouted for signs of intruders. He understood that the threats were not immediate, they were cunning, patient, and potentially dangerous. The child in his care depended entirely on him, and he was determined to preempt any attempt to reclaim or exploit her. Her life had been purchased once. It would not be threatened again. One night, as the wind whispered through the trees and the firelight flickered in the cabin, the rancher noticed unusual footprints near the edge of the property. They were subtle, almost imperceptible in the soft soil, but he had learned to read such signs. Someone had been close, observing the ranch, waiting for an opportunity. His heart quickened not with fear, but with a fierce resolve. The newborn, now sleeping peacefully nearby, was entirely unaware of the danger lurking beyond the safety of her walls. He knew he could not rely solely on physical barriers. He needed to prepare the child in age-appropriate ways for a world that could be harsh. Though she was too young to understand fully, the rancher began to instill a sense of awareness and caution through gentle exposure. He allowed her to explore the ranch in small, supervised increments, teaching her to recognize safe zones, to respond to his voice, and to develop a subtle awareness of her environment. Each small lesson was a foundation for future resilience, preparing her for challenges she might one day face. The presence of potential threats also deepened the emotional bond between them. The rancher's protective instincts intensified, and the child, even in her infancy, began to sense his vigilance. Though she could not articulate it, she felt the assurance of his care. Every gentle touch, every whispered word, every watchful gaze reinforced her sense of security and trust. In return, her responses, cues, soft movements, and the occasional grasp of his fingers strengthened his resolve. They were partners in survival, even if she did not yet understand the stakes. As the weeks passed, the rancher devised a system to monitor the property more effectively. He established hidden lookout points, reinforced entryways, and prepared emergency plans in case intruders attempted to approach. The child became an integral part of this new rhythm, her awareness gradually increasing under his guidance. Each day, as she grew stronger and more alert, he felt a quiet reassurance that she could eventually respond to the world with confidence and skill, even if danger returned. The looming threat served as a reminder that safety was not permanent. It had to be actively maintained. Yet it also highlighted the success of their bond. The rancher's vigilance and her growing trust had created a fortress far more resilient than mere fences and gates. The child was no longer entirely defenseless, and the rancher's determination had ensured that her survival was no longer dependent solely on luck or chance. By the end of this period, the rancher understood a vital truth. Life's dangers could never be entirely eliminated, but careful preparation, protection, and trust could create a buffer strong enough to allow growth and resilience. The child had survived the auction. the journey to the ranch, and now she was thriving under the careful, watchful eyes of a man who would not allow harm to touch her. The shadows of the past remained, but within the safety of the ranch, she had begun to grow into her potential, resilient and ready for the challenges ahead. As the newborn grew into a curious toddler, the rancher recognized that her survival depended not only on physical care but also on guidance and learning. The days at the ranch became filled with lessons disguised as daily routines, each task carefully designed to teach her about the world around her, instill confidence, and nurture resilience. The rancher approached these lessons with patience, understanding that trust and careful guidance were just as crucial as nourishment and warmth. The mornings were gentle and structured. After breakfast, the toddler was introduced to small chores appropriate for her age, always under the watchful eyes of the rancher. She learned to fetch soft items, help with basic feeding of the animals, and even observe the careful tending of crops and stables. While these tasks seemed mundane, each was a subtle lesson in responsibility, observation, and respect for life. The rancher spoke to her as he worked, narrating every movement, naming objects, and explaining the natural processes around her. His words were steady and deliberate, creating a sense of understanding even before she could fully comprehend language, beyond practical skills. The rancher focused on teaching her emotional resilience. He encouraged her to face minor frustrations, spilled water, a stubborn rope, or a stubborn animal, allowing her to experience problem-solving within a safe environment. When she became frustrated, he remained calm and guided her gently, never forcing outcomes but offering reassurance and practical solutions. In these moments, the toddler began to learn patience, perseverance, and self-confidence, qualities that would be essential for navigating a world that had once threatened her. Very life, the rancher also emphasized observation and awareness. He introduced her to the natural world surrounding the ranch, pointing out the tracks of animals, the patterns in the wind, and the changes in weather. Through these lessons, she began to recognize the rhythms of life beyond the safety of the cabin. The rancher taught her to listen carefully to sounds, to notice details in her environment, and to trust her instincts. These skills were not only practical, they reinforced a sense of autonomy and awareness, building the foundation for her eventual independence. In addition to practical and observational lessons, the rancher nurtured her curiosity and imagination. He told stories of the animals on the ranch, of the land, and of the stars overhead, often blending fact with gentle fiction. These stories offer both entertainment and moral guidance, teaching lessons about kindness, courage, and compassion. The toddler's eyes would widen with fascination as she listened, her young mind absorbing more than she could yet articulate. These moments of shared storytelling deepened their bond, reinforcing trust and a sense of belonging. Physical development remained a key focus. The rancher encouraged movement and coordination through safe exercises, play, and supervised exploration. She learned to climb small slopes, balance on logs, and navigate the varied terrain of the ranch under his careful supervision. Each activity strengthened her body and confidence, demonstrating that she was capable and resilient. The rancher celebrated her small victories quietly, reinforcing the importance of effort and perseverance rather than immediate perfection. Emotionally, the toddler grew increasingly attached to the rancher. Her trust, once cautious and tentative, blossomed into reliance and affection. She recognized his presence as a source of safety and guidance, often seeking him out for reassurance or comfort. The rancher, in turn, continued to balance protection with the encouragement of independence, knowing that nurturing both was essential for her long-term well-being. By the end of this period, the toddler had transformed from a fragile, dependent infant into a lively, observant, and resilient child. She had learned early lessons in survival, problem-solving, and emotional awareness, all under the careful mentorship of the rancher. The foundation for her future, both in terms of safety and character, was firmly established. In the quiet evenings, as the fire crackled and the animals settled down, the rancher would watch her rest or play, reflecting on the journey from the auction hall to this point. He had rescued her life once, but now he was shaping it, teaching her to understand, navigate, and thrive in a world that had once been indifferent. The lessons in life were ongoing, subtle, and powerful, and each day brought new opportunities for growth, resilience, and trust. The peaceful rhythm of life at the ranch was suddenly disrupted one autumn afternoon. Dark clouds rolled across the sky, casting long shadows over the fields and forests surrounding the ranch. While storms were not unusual, this one carried an air of unpredictability, and the rancher sensed an underlying tension beyond the weather itself. His vigilance, honed through months of protecting the child, heightened instinctively. Something was approaching, not just the storm, but a challenge to the sanctuary they had built together. The toddler, now more aware and curious about her surroundings, watched from the cabin window as the wind rattled the trees. She clung instinctively to the rancher's hand, sensing the subtle tension in his movements. Over time, she had developed a growing awareness of danger, and though she was still young, she could sense when something was amiss. The rancher knelt to meet her gaze, offering reassurance with a gentle squeeze of her hand. "Stay close to me," he said quietly, and she obeyed, trusting him completely. As the storm intensified, the rancher noticed tracks in the mud leading toward the ranch, footprints unfamiliar and deliberate. Someone had been watching, waiting for an opportunity to intrude. He had anticipated that threats might come, but the immediacy of their presence elevated the stakes. He swiftly guided the child to a secure room within the cabin, a space he had previously reinforced for emergencies. There, he ensured she was wrapped in blankets and shielded from both the wind and potential intruders. The intruders approached cautiously, unaware of the rancher's preparation. But the rancher, experienced in anticipating threats, moved strategically. He blocked vulnerable access points, monitored escape routes, and maintained a calm, controlled presence. The child, observing his focused determination, began to understand the gravity of the situation. While she could not fully comprehend danger, she felt the tension, the seriousness, and the protective energy emanating from him. The confrontation, when it came, was tense but brief. The rancher's foresight and preparedness allowed him to secure the property and prevent the intruders from reaching the child. He used his knowledge of the terrain, the ranch layout, and his own physical strength to maintain control, ensuring her safety above all else. Throughout the ordeal, the toddler remained close to him, sensing that her survival depended on staying near her protector. Each whispered reassurance from the rancher calmed her growing fear, reinforcing the bond of trust that had been nurtured over months of care. Once the intruders retreated, the rancher surveyed the aftermath. The storm had passed, leaving debris scattered across the fields, but the child was safe, unharmed, and secure. The rancher took a deep breath, realizing that their life together had reached a pivotal moment. The child had not only survived the storm and the external threat, but had also witnessed, in a small way, the measures required to protect and endure. This test of survival became a turning point in her development. The rancher began to introduce her to more structured lessons in awareness and response. They practiced recognizing signs of danger in the environment, understanding the importance of staying close to trusted protectors, and learning simple skills to navigate challenges safely. These exercises were gentle and age-appropriate, but they instilled in her the foundations of caution, observation, and resilience. Emotionally, the event solidified her trust in the rancher. She had seen him act decisively to protect her, demonstrating both strength and calm in the face of danger. The toddler began to internalize the concept that while threats existed, careful attention, preparation, and trust could ensure safety. She also learned the beginnings of courage, not recklessness, but the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was not alone. By the end of this period, the rancher and child had emerged stronger. The storm and the threat had tested not only the physical boundaries of the ranch, but also the emotional and psychological resilience of both protector and child. The toddler had begun to develop the skills and instincts that would serve her for the rest of her life, while the rancher's commitment to her safety had proven unwavering. Together, they had turned a moment of potential crisis into a lesson of survival, trust, and empowerment. The experience reinforced the overarching truth that life, though fraught with dangers, could be navigated successfully through vigilance, preparation, and the steadfast presence of someone who truly cared. It was a lesson neither of them would forget, a foundation for the strength, independence, and resilience that would define her future. Years had passed since the night the rancher first rescued her from the cold, indifferent auction hall. The tiny, fragile newborn had grown into a spirited and resilient young girl, her dark eyes now full of curiosity, intelligence, and the quiet confidence that came from a childhood carefully nurtured under the rancher's unwavering care. The once vulnerable child had flourished, transforming the sanctuary of the ranch into a home where she understood the meaning of safety, love, and self-worth. Her daily routines were no longer solely about survival. They included learning, exploration, and the development of skills that would serve her throughout her life. She helped tend to the animals with confidence, recalling lessons the rancher had taught her as a toddler. She remembered how to read the behavior of the livestock, care for them, and anticipate their needs. Each task reinforced a sense of competence and self-reliance, reminding her that she was capable and strong. The rancher observed her attentively, proud but quiet, content to let her grow while remaining a steady, guiding presence. The girl had also developed a keen understanding of the natural world. She could recognize subtle changes in weather, identify animal tracks, and navigate the terrain of the ranch with skill and confidence. These abilities, taught through years of gentle guidance and hands-on experience, were far more than practical. They were symbols of the resilience and adaptability she had learned to carry within herself. The rancher had instilled in her the awareness that life could be unpredictable, and that preparedness and observation were tools to navigate its uncertainties. Beyond physical skills, the emotional growth she had experienced was profound. She had learned trust, empathy, and compassion, qualities that had been nurtured in her from infancy. The child who once trembled in fear at the cold indifference of strangers now offered kindness to both animals and people. She had internalized lessons of patience, problem-solving, and emotional regulation, allowing her to face challenges with a calm, measured approach. Her interactions reflected not only intelligence but also a deep understanding of the value of care and protection. The rancher had remained a constant figure in her life, his presence a quiet reassurance rather than a dominating authority. He never sought credit for her growth or accomplishments. His satisfaction came from witnessing her development into a capable, independent individual. Their bond, forged through trust, patience, and shared challenges, had matured into a relationship built on mutual respect and deep affection. She knew, even in moments of quiet reflection, that he had been the one to save her not just from immediate danger, but from a life of neglect and vulnerability. One afternoon, as they walked along the ridge overlooking the ranch, the young girl paused to watch the sunset, casting golden hues across the fields and hills. She reflected on the journey that had brought her here from the cold, chaotic auction hall to the warm, secure embrace of the ranch. Memories of her early fragility surfaced, but they were tempered by the gratitude and determination that had grown within her. She had been given a second chance, and she intended to honor it fully. The rancher stood beside her, silent but attentive, as he always had been. Without words, he communicated trust, protection, and pride. In that quiet moment, it was clear that their shared journey had come full circle. The child had become strong, independent, and resilient, yet she remained connected to the rancher who had given her life back. She carried with her not only the physical strength to navigate the world, but the emotional fortitude to face adversity with courage and compassion. In time, she would leave the ranch to explore the wider world, but the lessons she had learned would remain with her always. The rancher's quiet mentorship, the safe environment he had created, and the unwavering care he had provided had equipped her with the tools to thrive. She understood that life could be both harsh and beautiful, and that her survival and growth were the result of courage, resilience, and the kindness of one man who had chosen to see her worth. The story that began in chains and uncertainty ended with empowerment and hope. She had survived the auction, endured the challenges of infancy, and emerged as a capable, compassionate individual. Her life had been redeemed, and the promise made on that first night to protect her, nurture her, and give her the chance to flourish had been fulfilled. In the security of the ranch, under the watchful eyes of her protector, she had discovered the full meaning of freedom, the freedom to grow, to trust, and to become the person she was always meant to be.